Hi, welcome to Write More Light. My name is Sarah with the Midwest Writing Center, and I am so happy to be back after a way too long hiatus with one of my favorite people, who is also one of the coolest intellectuals I know. I'm just gonna get into, no, I'm not. I'm gonna tell you what today's gonna look like. We're gonna have about 45 minutes with Carolin Schneider, and we are gonna ask lots of hard questions. If you're here live with us, feel free to submit some questions because I know nothing about this topic, and that's why I'm so excited about it. So here we go. I'm gonna read her bio. Carolin Schneider is a lecturer in English linguistics at the Department of Languages, Literature, and Communications at Utrecht University. Her research areas include multilingualism, critical discourse analysis, and interpersonal pragmatics in online and offline contexts. Primarily, she investigates discourses with and about dementia. Her PhD thesis explores how English-Spanish bilinguals living with Alzheimer's dementia draw on their linguistic repertoires in conversations. In 2019, she founded the quarterly digital roundtable Intersections in Dementia Discourse, bringing together international and interdisciplinary perspectives from research and society. She is currently working on her PhD, but did graduate with summa cum laude in the process of receiving it. She received Best Emerging Scholar paper on her paper, Ageism in the Pandemic, from the North American Network on Aging Studies. And I'm going to link to a bunch of places where she's been published if you're interested in reading her research, which it's heady. It's academic work, but it's very interesting and very cool. Carolin, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. And I'm very excited to share what I know and hear what you know. And let's do this.
Let's do this. Okay. The first question is the obvious one. What in the heck is linguistic pragmatics? Or what are linguistic pragmatics?
What is pragmatics?
Teach me the grammar, please.
Let me back up for a second.
Okay. Tell me like I'm 5.
Pardon?
Tell me like I'm 5.
Okay. So usually I start by explaining what linguistics is in general. So oftentimes what happens is when people study language or English, they expect it to be just literature and culture. But then they encounter something that's called linguistics or English linguistics, and that's the system of the language. You don't have to necessarily study that language dependent. You can study linguistics without having a focus on a specific language system. So within
what is a language system?
Any language has a system. And linguistics is more or less the study of that language. So within, if we want to focus on English for just a second, within linguistics, we talk about different circles when it comes to the formal side of language. So we have the sound, we have the structure, and we have meaning. So sound would be phonetics and phonology, those little funky symbols that you might see in dictionaries sometimes. That's the IPA. That's the most inner circle. So the first building block of language.
IPA would be the International Phonetic Alphabet.
Yes, it's not the PAL. It is the International Phonetic Alphabet. So that's the inner circle. That's the sound. Then we have structure. So that would be morphology and syntax. Morphology is basically the smallest meaning bearing units. So cat, for instance, is a morpheme, and cats, plural, the S is also a morpheme because it bears the meaning of plural, right? So that would be very small building blocks in structure. And then when we want to build entire sentences, we get to syntax. When we move over to meaning, we again have the smaller unit, semantics, so the meaning of a word. And then we move on to pragmatics. So when we still envision the circle that I mentioned earlier. Pragmatics would be the outer circle. So the meaning of a word in context, the meaning of a phrase in context, the intended meaning by the speaker, what is heard by the hearer, and so on and so forth. So this is the most abstract of the formal circles, because it can go in any kind of direction. So to answer your question in short, pragmatics is the study of language meaning.
That's so great. Something that we say a lot at the center, Ryan and I, is that language belongs to those who use it. And when I learned this was your area of study, and still not entirely sure I comprehend, that was the first thing I thought of, was that it is so someone is there studying how we communicate and the purpose and use of our language. Is that anywhere close?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not joking or like playing dumb. It sounds so cool. And that's why I wanted to get you here, and also why I didn't ask you questions in advance, because I think that if I'm here along with whoever may be joining us, genuinely not knowing, and you're this wonderful wealth of information, we need to start from zero. Whew. I want to point out for anyone who may not know, not only are you multilingual, but English is your second language, third language?
Second. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I was born and raised in Germany and came to the US when I was 15, and I've been back and forth ever since. Now I'm joining you from Germany, but I'm working in the Netherlands. So to everyone who has had some knowledge or has ever been to Europe, probably knows that Europe is very multilingual in general. So yeah.
Yeah, we don't have that so much. How many languages do you feel fluent in?
Fluent. I want to say English and German.
Spanish?
And Spanish. My Spanish, I'm probably still more fluent than most people.
Yeah, that's why I asked how you feel, because I would probably add 3 more languages to your list of fluent. And
I haven't spoken in a while, so.
How many can you use conversationally?
It really depends. So receptively, there's also Dutch, of course, now because I work in the Netherlands and I've taken some language courses, and a lot of the administrative stuff is in Dutch. I just don't dare to speak. So it's so interesting to be teaching a language, be like, yeah, you have to use it. You have to really use and apply your knowledge, and you have to apply the words, and you will get better. And then you start over with a new language from scratch, and then you just don't dare to speak, and you're at the same level as other language learners. So I think that's quite an interesting experience. And I highly recommend at any age, just starting a new language. It's a fun experience, and it's a great challenge. But
I remember being in high school and in college and studying language and being like, hell yeah, I can do this. I'm gonna talk to everybody everywhere. And I'm trying now, and I'm like, why is this hard?
I can tell you why this is hard also. Best example from my own experience when I was 15 and in high school. My host dad back then said, well, you're pulling my leg, right? And I mean, I knew the individual meaning, so that would be the semantics for those of you who are interested in linguistics. So I knew the individual meaning of the words, you're pulling my leg, right? So it was sort of an assertion and with a question, right? Like just making sure if this is really something that is happening. I knew the meaning of you are pulling my leg. But that didn't make any sense to me. So what I was lacking was the pragmatic understanding that this is an idiom and the context in which this is used. Because clearly in a situation where there would have been a little puppy pulling at my leg, literally, my understanding of those words would have made sense. But in that situation with my host dad, it didn't at all, right? So this is pragmatics, language and context, and how meaning of language changes depending on the contextual situation around it. So pragmatics is something really important to learn with a language. So to understand which contexts are appropriate to use a language or a word or a term or a sentence, for example.
I hadn't even thought of idioms. I mean, I think about idioms. I think about idioms often, but not in this context. I think about them often because they're impossible if you aren't from the culture that developed them. They're just impossible. And I like to think about them about like how like maybe this is just because like my brain doesn't do normal things. But I'm always like, well, obviously this means I can't think of an idiom that makes sense. I was like elbow grease.
Well, yeah, but yeah, you just have to learn them. Mm-hmm. Basically, you have to learn them separately from the dictionary from your study book. Right? You have to learn them in context, otherwise it doesn't make sense.
Here's one that does make sense. So maybe it's not even an idiom. Maybe it's just a thing people say. I don't want to announce this. I didn't know until last week. I knew what this phrase meant, but my understanding of the etymology being the way the phrase came to be, was so wrong. And I don't want to admit this. The phrase is playing by ear, right? Which obviously comes from playing music. You you play what comes to you rather than reading music, right? And when we say we're going to play something by ear, we mean we'll see how the day goes. We'll see where the day takes us. And there's other things like on the TV show Friends, there was an episode in which the character Joey, who's, not smart, says something is a moo point. It's like a cow's point of view. It doesn't matter. And it's a moot point. So he thought it was an idiom, which it's not. And so he understood the meaning and he could use it properly, but he wasn't right about the words, which is just a tangent I've gone on.
I had the same thing happen, and this is also sometimes words sound alike, but and they're pronounced alike, but they're written differently and have different meanings. So the phrase "no hard feelings," I always thought like hard, the different hard, not heart, So that was. It took me a while, and I'm not going to say I wasn't days old. It's been a while that I learned this, but I went around for quite a while assuming the other word. So yes, that there is a difficulty in idioms and foreign languages.
I will admit what I thought it meant a week ago.
Okay, I wasn't going to ask, but
I was really trying to avoid it.
I was hoping you were going to say it.
And I figured it out by myself. I didn't like say something out loud and have a bunch of people stare at me for my mistake. In my defense, I thought it referred to an ear of corn.
Welcome to Iowa.
There's like 4 ways. I thought it was like we'd go out in the morning and see how the plants were doing. And that's how we would make our decisions.
That's so amazing.
I have no idea why I thought that. My spouse told me it was the most, quote, grotesquely Iowan thing he's ever heard. I can't imagine I came up with that meaning on my own, but like
That's the best explanation ever.
the real meaning makes sense, and mine could make sense if you tried really hard.
Well, in your context, if I may say, you were in the middle of cornfields.
I wasn't.
Well, but sort of. So yeah.
Anyway, I'm like, I'm almost proud of how ridiculous that is, but mostly embarrassed. Anyway,
No, I don't think that's embarrassing at all. I think that's a really cute explanation and really context dependent.
right. So the definition, if I say it, I'm using it correctly, but I have no understanding of the etymology of the term. What are you going to say? And words have etymology. We find out the root and where it came from and its history and how it came to this place. But I assume that is somewhere in the syntax and when we're talking about sentences.
Yeah, well, that's historic linguistics and the development of language. So that would not be necessarily my field of study because I'm more concerned with modern context. But I do geek out a lot about where certain words come from and Google the etymology myself, and then like different languages and crossovers and language families and all that. But I'm really not qualified to speak about that in a professional manner. It's more like a pet peeve.
So there's something I like to use, which is the expert in the room. I'm asking you as the expert in the room. So I understand that in a professional capacity, you're like, this isn't something that I can talk about. There are people out there who are experts. But like, don't worry about that in this moment or this context. Something related, hopefully. I was having a conversation the other day about, the conversation started about families living together. Like, you live with your grandparents and your parents and your children. Or you live very close with your grandparents, your parents, your children, your aunts, your cousins, right? And it was suggested to me, and I think this is true, but I haven't looked into it, that you can tell based on the words in the language, what if a culture has developed from this, from that place, or if a culture has been, more based on the immediate nuclear family situation. And the suggestion was, if there is a word, like one word for my paternal aunt versus my maternal aunt, where I would call both of them my aunt in English. And in languages where the extended family is more centered, they have a specific word for that. Is that real? It sounds real to me, but now I'm asking you.
Okay, hang on. What was the question? I do. There are language systems where there are different terms for individual family relations, depending on which side of the family the aunt, for example, comes from. But what was your question? Depending on whether you live with your nuclear family or your extended family?
If a culture has developed such that the extended family keeps in close contact, physical contact, that would be they would have more words to distinguish the exact relation.
I am not sure. If we look at certain Latin American cultures, they are pretty close to their entire family, and I don't think there's any other term other than tia, for example. So there's no direct distinction whether it's paternal, maternal. So I don't know. There might be some truth to that, but
it's sociological as much as it is like so.
Yeah, I guess if you live with a bunch of your aunts and uncles and cousins, at least to narrow it down a little bit, it makes sense to have more specifiers and really specific terms for individuals. Just like the Inuit, for example, have 300 terms for snow, and for us, it's just snow, right? So whatever you just said it in the beginning, language is for those who use it, and well, let's use it the way we need it to function for us, right? So if we need more terms,
We develop them.
Yeah.
That's so cool. I mean, it's obvious, right? Like that's how language happened, period. It was for utility. But it's still really cool. Okay, so with respect to pragmatics in the contemporary world, as new language develops, how does that affect your work, your research? So like dictionaries add a new 30 words every year or whatever, and we always see ridiculous headlines about like why X word was added, and it's always the most controversial word. Somebody's going to be offended. But does that have a direct impact on your work? I would assume that it would when we develop new language.
It sort of depends on what exactly I want to analyze. So if I want to, okay, I don't know when I've gotten so bad with coming up with examples on the spot, but
it's really hard. It's really hard.
So let's see, if I want to look at how identity is constructed online, for example. So I usually do that within communities of dementia, people living with dementia, or people who are caring for someone who's living with dementia. But I also had a project with a colleague of mine just on YouTube and YouTube comments, and how Latinx identity is constructed with code choices, for example. And when I say code choices, code is language. So the code is any language, but also any register. So whether I say, ooh, I'm really displeased, like I'm really pissed, right? This is could also be a code. So two different code choices in that case. So when I look at identity construction online, and I look at, for example, how Latinx identity is constructed, we can look at implicit and explicit identity markers that people use to describe themselves, right? So I'm Latina, for example, is something that people wrote in the comments, but then that's a really explicit marker, right? And it's also identifying gender. But then people don't want to reveal their gender, or they're non-binary, which in case of Spanish is, of course, still a little problematic, but it's evolving. So that affects my work, right? So how do people identify and create their identity online? We will never know the real person behind this. We will only know the internet persona, the identity that has been created on that platform or within that data set, right? So whenever something new comes up, so we have a variety of, for example, pronouns or versions of identifying or non-identifying with a specific gender, right? So that is just the newest example that I can come up with right now, but that really affects work on identity construction, for example.
So we have what we call neo-pronouns in English, which are just outside of what we would traditionally use. Z's or zers, or fey, fair are two examples. Do you see that in other languages? I'm just curious, I guess. It's not that important.
I was so worried that it would come to this when I would. I'm the one who went there. So we have similar pronouns in German, but to be honest, I couldn't tell you because I haven't been moving much within the German community. So my friends have all the same pronouns they've had for years. in German.
Mhm.
But I can tell you in Dutch. So in Dutch, it's hen and hun, which is also a new pronoun for non-binary, which I think is really cool. And I've also I learned this from my colleagues, but I also learned this from my students, and I also learned it in class. So actually, when I was learning Dutch in Dutch classes, so that made me really happy that it's not something, because you and I mean, we go way back, and we had this discussion once. I think it's maybe 5 years ago, that it's more difficult for someone, and by now I've come around, and I want to say no, it's not more difficult for someone whose second language or third language it is, to get used to neopronouns. But it takes some adjustment, yes, but I don't think it makes that big of a difference, because we learn new words every day, no matter which language it is. I learn new German words every day. So maybe they're not new German words in the sense that they were newly added to our repertoire, but they might be really old-fashioned words that just pop up somewhere in some context that I've never heard, right? So no, I don't think it would take longer to learn new pronouns, but because that's what we talked about like 5 years ago. It's like, yeah, but don't be so hard on yourself. It's not your first language, but yeah, no.
Just filling my heart so big. Uh, so as this, we're curving back. As pragmatics specifically, the meaning of words in context and as intended applies to folks with multilingual people with dementia. That seems like just a huge, crazy category. Help, I guess. What I'm asking is, how do you do that? What does that mean in context?
Okay, so micro level, or you want the whole big thing, or do you want just small bits? Okay. So what I did in my doctoral thesis is basically I looked at the functions of code switches. So when bilingual people use both of their languages, that is often called code switching. So when within a sentence they wechseln plötzlich die Sprache, that would be a code switch, right? So it's just switching into a different language. So I was looking or talking with bilingual people living with Alzheimer's dementia and their primary care partners. So that was usually a spouse or a child. And we were talking in English and in Spanish, the three of us. And they could choose whether they want to speak in English the entire time, in Spanish the entire time, switch between the languages. It was up to them. And
did you set that parameter at the start, or that's just
yes.
Okay.
Yes. No, that was part of the condition of the conversation, that I wanted to see if they were left free to speak in whichever code choice they desire, what language would they pick, and how often would they switch? Because regular behavior between findings have shown that it's a regular pattern between people who speak two languages and with people who speak the same language set, that they do switch back and forth, because sometimes it's just more convenient, right? So the word retrieval is faster. Maybe the other language doesn't have an adequate term or a much longer term for it. So it's just more convenient to just simply switch, and the other person will know. Then also certain languages serve certain functions in certain areas in life. So my professional life, for example, is entirely in English. And I was just recently asked whether or not I want to teach in German. And I said, no, there's no way I can do this in German. This would take me a lot of time to prepare. I mean, the terminology is probably very similar, but still, I mean, English is the language of my profession, so and a lot of other areas as well, but not German isn't. So I cook in German, for example, and I speak German when I cook. But as soon as I start talking about research, I switch to English, no matter whether my colleague, for example, is German. Yeah, so code switching is a pretty regular and pretty normal thing. And what I did is I analyzed where and when people living with dementia code switched in narrative interviews, which were more or less regular conversation with just a couple of prompter questions. And I analyzed the function. So why, like, what could this mean that this person switched and this particular word or this part of, and Alzheimer's didn't really change the function of the code switch. So all the functions that you would expect to find and that have been found in other code switched conversations, for example, to structure the conversation, right? So if I'm talking to you and I have a little side mark or an anecdote, I'm to structure and make it really clear that this is not what I really want to tell you, I would switch over to the other language and just say a couple sentences in that language and then switch back to English. And this is the kind of thing that happened. Why I wanted to do this is mainly because there are a lot of rumors out there that if you're living with dementia, that you involuntarily switch, so that you don't realize which language you are speaking, which I found not to be true. So I've spoken to a lovely lady who was 93, I believe, without my cheat sheet. I started talking to her in English and she replied in Spanish that, no, I'm not going to speak any English anymore. So she realized and she recognized the language and had a language awareness of her own, that she did not want to speak this language anymore. Whether she could, I don't know, of course, but she could understand it, right? So, but she didn't want to reply. So I don't know about involuntary switches. I couldn't find any. They were all on purpose, as in my data set at least, and I had 10 people with different development of Alzheimer's. So some were just diagnosed and some had been living with the diagnosis for 15 years and already more severe symptoms. So
that's really interesting. My one of my grandmothers had Alzheimer's, and I mean she passed, I want to say, in 5 years. So that's really, really heartening, really cool to hear that you're speaking to people who are living with Alzheimer's for 15 years. That's really, really heartening. I mean, she wasn't verbal in the end because she just didn't have those faculties. Her brain had lost its ability to control her body. But that's really, really wonderful. I'm wondering, because something that I have seen in my experience with folks with Alzheimer's and dementia, is that there's an awareness of a loss of ability that can maybe present itself as insecurity or becomes insecurity. And I'm wondering if you think that could be I know you don't know and you can't say definitively, but I'm wondering if you think that could be a reason for a decision not to speak a certain language. Could also be emotional, of course.
Yeah, I can't say. I mean, like I said in the beginning, I don't feel comfortable speaking Dutch to my Dutch colleagues, right? So if I feel not safe because of so many uncertainties around me, then I would avoid adding more uncertainty to it and just decide not to speak that language. However, a lot of people who said, well, yeah, I don't speak that much English anymore, they code switched back and forth. And at some point I'm like, you just told me you don't speak any English anymore. You almost spoke English for 10 minutes with me. Like, what's going on? And I think feeling safe is so important for just anybody, really. But especially for people living with dementia, because there are so many question marks and so many uncertainties that you might lose track of who you're talking with at that very moment. Yeah. So what really is also striking, because you just mentioned your grammar, communication is just so important to maintain a sense of self and self-worth and autonomy and identity, and to just keep communicating with the person, even though the person might not be responding back. Like I said, the lady who was already over 90 years old, she could understand what I was saying in English, and it would be so hurtful to just assume someone does not understand just because they don't speak. Again, I'm using myself as an example here. Dutch and German are pretty similar. Once you understand the rules of how things are pronounced in Dutch versus German, you understand so much more. I wouldn't be able to produce the kind of content, but I understand nearly everything. And to just assume I don't understand because I don't speak it would be a mistake. And that's the same with, especially with someone who once spoke Spanish, for example, fluently, and just decides not to speak it anymore. To just assume, or English fluently and decides not to speak English anymore, just to go, she doesn't understand, so we can talk bad about her or whatever.
That's, you hit like a very particular heartstring for me. My other grandmother often refused to speak English. She spoke Spanish and she spoke Armenian. And I think that was in an effort to, I'm guessing, I think that was in an effort to get us to learn to speak to her. But there was no question that she spoke it. When she went out in public, she had to, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time. Thank you. Something I wanted to say, you used the term code switching, and I've only seen it in the context of code switching within one language.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the same meaning, right? The way that you used it and the way that I have used it. But it's also something that I had hoped to talk with you about in the realm of pragmatics. I'm gonna have to just keep remembering to say that word, and not a different word. Which, right, when I say I was code switching, there's and I don't know how to do this with different words, so bear with me. I would say there's a professional language, there's an at-home language, right? And I'm only speaking English. I am not so lucky as to be multilingual. So the way that we speak, the words that we use, the tones that we use, you use the word register in a friend group that you went to high school with versus your family versus a friend group that you developed in the workplace, you would speak very, very differently. And I would call that code switching, right? And when you're doing it, you're using the term code switching to mean multiple languages, meaning different words, different pronunciation, or Fraggle Rock. The word language is really a problem right now. Anyway, so when you deal with pragmatics in the context of code switching within a single language, God, I don't know. Do you do that? Do you look at code switching within a single language?
But then I usually call it style shifting just to be more precise, because there is a term
It's
that I can
clearer. Yeah.
use. Yeah. So I would usually say, okay, we all, and that's not necessarily just pragmatics. It's also a part of social linguistics. So if you imagine the circles in the beginning, with the formal levels of language, if you envision certain pie pieces, that's different linguistic subfields. So I'm somewhere in between. So I'm a pragmatician at heart. That's what I do. But I'm somewhere in between sociolinguistics, but then also discourse analysis. So I might throw around some terms that are not directly correlated to pragmatics. So what you just mentioned is you use different language with your friends from high school than you would use with your new boss at work. And that's more style shifting and register, like picking the right register. And that's all tied to social linguistics. So how do people speak when to whom? And this is all, of course, contextually embedded. It always comes back to context. So that's my favorite thing to tell my students. It always comes back to context, and it depends. You, by choosing your words, depending on who you talk to, you also choose what to reveal about yourself. Right? Do you want to give away that you're from the Midwest, or do you want to give away, I don't know, that you hung out with friend group so and so? Because friend groups kind of develop their own idiosyncrasies, so own patterns of speech, own terms. If you hang around a bunch of people, you all start talking alike after a while. You adapt each other's speech style and you influence each other. And then people will notice, oh, you hung out with person XYZ because they always say this particular word or this particular phrasing, or, oh yeah, you've been hanging out. Like, people already tell when I was talking to my friend in Cologne, because they have a different dialect in Cologne than they speak up here. And my friends in Cologne say, hey, yeah, you really sound like you're from the rural area. I've been living here now for 12 years, like more or less. And I do have a distinct markers of that dialect, of that region in my language. And then, but when I've talked to my friends from Cologne on the phone, I adapt back to certain features, and then people here say, hey, you've been talking to your friend on the phone, because we can really tell that your dialect is back.
You're like, what, an hour from Cologne?
Yes.
That's
so
not very far.
the thing about Europe, and dialects, and if you're somewhat familiar with British movies, or series, for example, you can tell how many different dialects and varieties there are in British movies and series, right? So, and that's pretty much true for all of Europe, because there have been so many different groups and territories and areas of people who formed speech communities, that these individual features could develop.
So cool. That's so cool. We are getting close to an hour, so I'm gonna make my final question, and then if you have anything else to add, please do. How did you end up in this field? How did you, what was the dot to dot?
So I studied to become a teacher, of English, Spanish, German, and German as a foreign language. And within my course of studies, I had linguistics for each subject. So for each language, I had linguistics classes. And at some point, I realized like how much fun this is. right? So the times you said, "Oh, this is so cool today," this is me during my course of studies, and then I wrote I wrote my final thesis for graduation, and while I was writing this, I was like, and it was a linguistics analysis of sexism in the press in the Oscar Pistorius case. Anyway, we're running out of time, so I'm not going to
No,
go
fine.
to.
No. Take all the time you need. I'm not doing anything until 3. And for you, 3 is in like 10 hours. So, wow, that's bad math. Anyway, go on.
That is bad math. Anyway. Anyway, so I was writing my final thesis before graduation, and I was enjoying it so much. I was doing a critical discourse analysis, like I said, on the Oscar Pistorius case and in newspaper headlines, and how sexist they were against Riva Steenkamp, who was actually a lawyer and not just an FHM model. And if you recall the case, it was shot on Valentine's Day by Oscar Pistorius, her then boyfriend, and Paralympic hero, sportsman. And he was just celebrated by the press for way too long. So while I was doing this analysis, I thought, okay, so if I graduate and become a teacher, this was the last linguistic analysis I'll ever do. And that made me really sad. So I decided to see what my options are. And I decided to keep doing what I love. And I decided to get my PhD. And that decision is now 5 years ago. Yeah, that's been 5 years since I decided I will do linguistics for the rest of my life. And I'm still a teacher. I mean, I teach, I'm a lecturer at university. So I do what I love in all ways, right? I can research and I can still teach and share my research with the students. And that's how I got where I am.
That makes me so happy. I can't believe I've never asked you that before. Because I knew you wanted to be a teacher, and I knew that you kept studying, and I was like, man, maybe college takes a long time in Germany.
There was just a lot of subjects. That's why I studied for so long, because I had to take Latin classes and Turkish classes, and I had to do a whole bunch of requirements to graduate the first time, and then yeah, and I decided to just keep going, and that's why it took so long.
I mean, I didn't. I always feel like there's other things to talk about when I talk to you, I guess. Other than the thing that you're spending your life working on. So I'm sorry for being rude. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us? This is, I think, like very could, should, would be required reading, is thinking about the way that language works, because it is what we use most to communicate, which is why I was so excited to have you.
Well, it's been great. I feel like I didn't talk about pragmatics a whole lot. So one of my sayings is, well, words matter. So even your word choices. So that's at the core of pragmatics. So what kind of word do you use instead of another word that you could have used? For people interested in linguistics, there is a really cool introduction to linguistics. It's called For the Love of Language. And I will provide Sarah with a reference link.
I'm putting it in the chat right now.
Okay.
Chat on Facebook.
Yeah. Well, if anybody has any questions about linguistics or pragmatics, for that matter, I'm more than welcome to answer any questions via email or whatever way of communication. Thank you so much for having me. This has been really interesting, really, really nice.
I have a follow-up thought. I have a friend who says she understands words based on their vibe, which I think is just, I mean, which I think means, right, that my brain and her brain work very differently. um, because I hear that and I start out with words have definitions. That's what we use to communicate.
Mm-mm. Well, yes, words do have definitions, but meaning of words is basically just conventional because it changes constantly. But yeah, please continue.
No. You interrupted at exactly the right moment, because that needed to be clarified. Yeah, so I'm wondering if that's, I guess, if that idea, this idea that words are a vibe, wish I had a better word to use, this idea that words are nebulous informs the way that language changes in context. It's a really huge question. You do not have to answer it. I have regrets.
I mean, there are a gazillion posts on Facebook and social media, Instagram, you name it, out there, from language loving people who just use the language the way they want to use it and play around with it, right? Like you can verb any sentence, you can sentence any language, you can switch around verbs and words, and it still makes sense, sort of, because you can use language any way you want to use it. The question is the way you say it and the way and in which context you say it. If your friend, is that words that she or they don't know, that they just come across, or is it words that they already have in their repertoire?
Both. It was a really confusing conversation. She said, you understand because you're a writer. And I was like, no, the opposite. If I don't, I spend so much time looking up definitions of words so that I can find the right one. So that was really, really confusing, but very interesting to me because, you know, we know not all people are verbal people, or like that's not their strong suit necessarily, that not all people think in words, right? I think in words. Somebody pointed out to me once that I think in words, and I was like, what are you thinking? Which shows, you know, my ignorance, but it also shows, you know, we don't know outside of our own experience a lot of the time. So I guess I'm just gonna have to question her about what vibes are. I thought maybe it might have something to do with synesthesia.
That was my thought, but also I just watched something on someone who saw the words in colors when people were speaking. So
for context, for anyone who may not know, synesthesia is a brain condition in which your senses overlap. So it happens a lot that people associate colors or personalities with letters, words, numbers, but there are a lot of different ways that can happen. There can be flavors, there can be smells. It's your senses overlapping.
Yeah, maybe that's when a word gives off a vibe, because her senses overlap.
I know someone who doesn't listen to a specific music artist because it's a color that they don't like, which is not something I can understand. But it's interesting and off topic. I apologize for digressing so much. I am so grateful for your time and expertise, and I want to know more. I've posted a bunch of Carolin's papers in the comments, so I'll do that too on YouTube. I'll put it in the video description, including a link to her website. And one other thing, we've got that that title, For the Love of Language.
Ask me for the papers if they're behind a paywall. Ask the authors for the papers. In this case, me. In other cases, the authors of academic papers. We are allowed to give them out, and you don't have to pay $35 for one paper.
Thank you. I love academics who love sharing their expertise.
I mean,
okay, so at this time in the show, I give updates on the Midwest Writing Center, and then we do a 5-minute free write. Carolyn, if you do not want to join us, you don't have to. I am so grateful for your time. I know that it's 9 p.m. for you, and you probably have things that you do at nighttime other than talk to me. So grateful. I think that you are just such a generous wealth that you have shared with us of knowledge, and a lot of things that I'm going to be ruminating on for quite some time. I obviously love language. I find it fascinating, and social seems like probably social linguistics would be more my jam than pragmatics, but also like not at all, because meaning and language are friends, but they are not brothers. I come up with metaphors. It's fine. So it's so awesome. I might beg you to come back when I have developed more of an understanding. Thank you so much.
you're so very welcome.
If you hop off, that's okay. I'm gonna do my super speed calendar bit for a moment. So thank you for joining us, audience. Today is December 8th. And we've got a lot of upcoming events at the Midwest Writing Center. Very importantly, something I'm very impassioned about, of course, is our year-end giving campaign. This is, everybody around the end of the year will ask you for money. What matters to me about when a nonprofit in particular asks me for money, I want to know where it's going. With the Midwest Writing Center, there are two important things. All donations are matched up to $5,000. So if you give us $1, we get $2. So everything gets doubled. Please keep that in mind, and don't feel like you have to give us a lot. Every penny counts for us because we're a teeny tiny nonprofit. And the second thing about where your money goes when you give to the Midwest Writing Center is directly to artists. We pay artists to perform, we pay artists to teach, and every dollar spent in a community, 90% of it stays in the community. Where if you go to some big company or some big box store, none of that money stays in your community. So we're helping our local community when we are paying these artists. Additionally, we provide scholarships to those with financial need, and a couple of other demographics such as veterans. But that means that anyone who cannot afford our workshops or classes to work with these incredible artists will be able to at no cost. So please consider giving to our year-end giving campaign. The website for that is, if you want more information, if you want to see more about our impact on the local community, if you want to read some testimonials, or just to give, would be mwcqc.org/2022-year-end-giving. Beyond that, we do have tons and tons of workshops coming up in the new year that I'm super excited about, because they're all awesome. I know this. I helped. I didn't really help, actually. I was in the room when the decisions were made on what workshops we were going to accept, and I'm just delighted by them. First, we're going to have something with Melissa Conway, who is an incredible artist, and MWC has published them before. You can buy their book Sundogs at all the local bookstores. But also, Melissa is super dynamic and creative and a wonderful teacher. This is a, I think, 4-week workshop on creating the mixtape. So using the principles of a mixtape. If you're making I guess playlist might be a playlist is similar, but not the same. You put a lot more time and energy into making a mixtape. So using the principles of a mixtape to write to write poetry or prose or whatever it is that comes naturally to you. This is a generative workshop, so we're going to use inspiration from lots of different places, lots of different genres to help us create fresh new work, particularly when we're in a rut. Then following that, that's going to be all January, every Thursday in January from 6 to 8 p.m. It'll be hybrid, so you can either come to the Writing Center or do that online. We, of course, are also doing our first and third Saturday of the month. We do Writer's Studio from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Time. That's on Zoom. That's with me. We have just a pretty traditional writers workshop group, but we operate under the assumption that you are the expert on your own writing, and we want to give you the feedback that will help you take this piece of writing where you want it to be. On January 28th, which is a Saturday from 1 to 3 Central Time, we will have a workshop called Things That Disappear. It's on pop culture and using references from pop culture in your writing. It'll also, we'll look at writing that has used pop culture references in it and see how it's effective, how to use it, how to be effective with it. But it's also a topic that I really like. I am so sorry, I don't off the top of my head remember the name of the instructor for this workshop. But it'll be really, really interesting to see what cultural references leave a lasting impression and how to do that most effectively, because pop culture is everything that's around us, and using cultural references is something that we're going to do in our language and in our written work. Then we have the first Thursday of every month for a few months. Let me see if that's no. We will have a workshop with, and these are all separate, independent, one-time workshops with author Ada Zalelian. The one in February 2nd from 5 to 7 p.m. Central Time is called Our Culture, Ourselves. It's about writing about your own culture. So that, I believe, is my general summary about things that are happening at the Midwest Writing Center. We're going to keep doing Write More Light. We're going to keep doing Writer's Studio. And we're going to keep hoping to see you everywhere we make content. Because we are after the 2 o'clock hour, I'm going to leave you with the assignment for your free write. Please set a timer for 5 minutes and write something, write a conversation, and then write the same conversation in different language. So if the conversation were, "Hey, Carolyn, how you doing?" It could also be, "Hello, Ms. Schneider, how was your weekend?" Bad example. This is why you're going to do it in writing. I'm not great at talking. I encourage you to think about the way that you use language. And as always, please write more light into your life.